Well, how does that work? It starts from childhood. It starts in kindergarten on television. There's selection for obedience from the very first moment. I mean, you just think about, I'm guessing, maybe I'm wrong, so you tell me if I'm wrong, but at least when I think about my own school experience or any other school experience I know about, there was selection for obedience. I ended up going to fancy colleges like this place. And the way I did it was, I know exactly how I did it, by shutting up, Like if I thought that the high school teacher was a horse's ass, which I did most of the time, I didn't say, hey, what you're saying. Actually, sometimes I did and got thrown out of class. But I learned not to say anything. Just say, okay, I'll do the next stupid assignment. And because I know that that's the way I get ahead, and ultimately I'll do this and that. If you have whatever ability it takes to do this kind of thing, and you are sufficiently disciplined and passive, you sort of make it through up to the higher echelons. There are people who don't. I know some, like some of my own kids just didn't. And they get into trouble. They're called behavior problems, or disruptive, or you stick drugs in them or something or other, because they're just too independent. And people who are independent are a pain in the neck. They disrupt the system, and they're going to be cut off one way or another. I can tell you, just in graduate school, I'm teaching mostly graduate school, and you read applications, you can detect between the lines when the person who's writing a recommendation is telling you, keep away from this person, they're going to cause you trouble, which means usually they're going to go off and do their own thing or something like that. I don't want to exaggerate. In the sciences, it's somewhat different. And the reason is the sciences simply require this kind of independence. They'll die, unless people are challenging all the time and questioning. So when you look at people who are, say, studying physics at MIT or something, yeah, it's totally different, because you just encourage people to be challenging and creative and so on and so forth. But in most areas, you don't. You want them to be passive and obedient and supportive, and to fit to fit some kind of niche inside a managerial system, which is top down and doesn't make too much of a fuss and so on. And the people who don't accept this, they're weeded out in one or another fashion. So, it's a tricky question. I don't mean to suggest there's an easy answer to your question, or if there is, I don't know it. But it seems to me that an awful lot of our whole system of kind of thought control, by that I mean education, television, family life, all sorts of things, is sort of geared to supporting that kind of passivity. And institutions that break out of it, as the labor movement does, they are subject to a lot of, they're crushed insofar as one can crush them. The labor movement always broke out of this. Its picture was always different from the very beginning. You go back to the beginnings of the labor movement, it's, farmers bitterly opposing the degrading and oppressive modes of industrial capitalist organization that were being forced on them. Actually, one of the most interesting books I know, if you haven't read it, I'd urge you to, is the first modern book on labor history that I know of, by a guy named Norman Ware, around 1924. It was just reprinted, so it's easy to get, but it's about the labor movement in eastern Massachusetts around 1850 and 60. It's mostly quotes from the labor press, which are just fascinating. It's mostly young women from the farms, what they called factory girls, like 18-year-old kid comes in from the farms and she's working in the mills in Lowell, or artisans in Boston, and people like that. They had their own press. They had a very lively, extensive press, big, in fact. It's like the scale of the commercial press in those days. And it's very interesting. It's very eloquent, it's very well written. They took for granted, as the labor movement always has, unless it's beaten out of people's heads, that those who work in the mills ought to own them. They regarded industrial capitalism as just another form of slavery. This is without, no Marx, no socialism, no foreign radicals, none of that stuff. It's all just working people from their own experience. Very literate, incidentally. One of the things they complained about was that their culture was being taken away from them. Like an artisan in Boston, if he had a little extra money, would hire a boy to read to him, and that meant read classics. They regarded they said, look, the values that we fought for in the American Revolution, they're being taken away from us. We're being forced into another kind of tyranny, which we don't want, namely the tyranny of the hierarchic industrial system. And they also opposed what they called the new spirit of the age. This is like 1850. The new spirit of the age is gain wealth, forgetting all but self. Okay, ever hear that one? A little fancier, but the same thing that is drilled into everyone's head every day today. You know, you got to gain wealth, forgetting about everybody else. Well, they were trying to drill it into people's heads in 1850, and they were resisting it because it's degrading. You know, it's not the way human beings are. It takes a long time to drive normal human sentiments out of people's heads, and they keep popping up again. And in fact, I think, at least it looks to me, the whole history of the labor movement is a struggle against the new spirit of the age. Well, that's one of the reasons it's constantly repressed. And other independent efforts are also constantly repressed, not always successfully. Like, the world's a lot better than it was 100 years ago, or 50 years ago for that matter, because these struggles tend to, you know, they get repressed, but they leave a residue. They have successes, and then they're beaten back, and then they go on from those successes, and over time it sort of gets better. Structures that are based on authority and dominance will try to will just normally act without anybody even thinking about it to block such tendencies. Now, sometimes they think about it, like in the manuals of the public relations industry. They think about it very hard, but you know, they're putting out billions of dollars a year to control the public mind. You better think about what you're doing. But most of the time, you don't think about it. You're just part of it. You know? Like, you don't think about the fact that when you go through school, you're being trained for obedience and passivity. But I think if you look back, you'll probably, at least if you're like my experience, will recognize that that happened. And when you watch television, let's say, you know, some sitcom, you don't think, well, I'm being exposed to the Mohawk Valley formula, but you are. I mean, that's the picture of life that's presented day after day after day on, you know, like people have personal problems or something like that, but nothing that would bring them together to work for some, you know, to struggle against the new spirit of the age. I mean, what's the last time you saw a sitcom about that? And in fact, what you get is this, you know, this stuff that flows out of the PR industry, very consciously. You know, I mean, in that case, it's mostly conscious. Another aspect of it is demonizing labor. So a major element in the huge public relations propaganda after the Second World War, you know, was strictly demonizing labor, and the labor movement knew that. You know, there was a fairly substantial labor press even then, as late as the 1950s. There were still about 800 labor newspapers, which are reaching maybe 20 or 30 million people a week. You know, not commercial media, but pretty substantial, and they're interesting reading too. They were trying to, as they put it, provide. This is just. I'm not talking about anything radical. You know, it's like no left-wing press or anything. Just labor newspapers. You know, the conservative American labor movement. We're talking about developing antidotes to the poisons of the kept press, commercial media, who were demonizing labor at every opportunity and trying to undermine our achievements and glossing over the crimes of the corporate rulers who run the society. You know, stuff like that. There's a good book on this one too. This just tells you something about American academic life. The first study that I've ever heard of, you know, in the United States on this major theme of modern history just appeared. University of Illinois Press. It's a book called Selling Free Enterprise by a woman named Elizabeth Fones Wolfe, F-O-N-E-S-Wolfe. It's kind of apolitical, but like she doesn't have, as far as I can see, any special point of view, but the material in it is pretty revealing. It's the next part of the story that I was going to get to. This hazard-facing industrialists, you know, and the rising political power of the masses that led to the Mohawk Valley formula and so on, that terrified the daylights out of the business community. Now, it was kind of put on hold during the Second World War, but it took off immediately after the Second World War at a huge scale, instantly, you know. And that's what she's talking about, selling free enterprise. The idea was, as they put it, remember that the United States came out of the Second World War pretty social democratic, like most of the world. You know, like just like those Italian workers who had to have ideas about worker management beaten out of their head by force. An awful lot of people in the United States too, like maybe half, thought that there ought to be popular control over industry in some fashion. You know, this is so exotic in the United States that the fashion was never described, but somehow that the government could do a better job than private power, things like that. There was enormous support for social programs, you know, medical programs and so on. That had to be beaten out of people's heads, and fast. The leaders of the public relations industry, she quotes a lot of them, they said, look, we have 3 to 5 years to save our way of life. We have to fight and quickly win what they called the everlasting battle for the minds of men, and indoctrinate people with the capitalist story so fully that they can repeat it, you know, on every opportunity, and on like that. And they weren't kidding around. I mean, for example, about 1/3 of the material in American schools, elementary schools, was coming straight out of corporate propaganda offices by the early 50s. Sports leagues were taken over, the churches were taken over, the universities were attacked. I mean, it was across the board, you know, major effort to try to win the everlasting battle for the minds of men. And it's still going on, you know. I mean, here it's conscious. You know, that part of it's conscious. Most of the participants, it's just, you know, it's in your bones. I mean, you've gone through especially if you've been through an elite educational system. And you know, then you're really deeply indoctrinated in it. So I don't know how to measure this, but like personal feeling is that you find more passivity and obedience in the elite centers than you do, like, you know, out in the streets or in the state colleges. Well, you know, Adam Smith once, you're supposed to worship him but not read him, you know, but it's worth reading too. He once remarked somewhere that if you find 2 businessmen talking to each other, they're involved in a conspiracy against the public, you know, something like that. And yeah, there's something to that, but you know, it's not as though, I mean, you can read descriptions like what you're saying, incidentally, in the business press. So, for example, in the Financial Times in London, which is like the main, you know, the most important business newspaper in the world, a couple of years ago they had an article by the economics correspondent of the BBC, you know, it's all very establishment stuff, in which he said that something like this, that what's evolving is what he called a de facto world government in a new imperial age. And the de facto world government is a set of shadowy institutions. I mean, they're there, you sort of know they're there, but you don't know what they're doing, which basically serve the interests of transnational capital and financial institutions. And he said, for example, the G7, you know, the 7 big rich countries, meaning just their executives, you know, and their leadership. Nobody else knows what they're doing. The IMF, the World Bank, you know, then the GATT Council, now it would be the World Trade Organization, and yeah, they get together and they're running a de facto world government. I think that's kind of a, you know, it's kind of a metaphor. I mean, like, it's not that they get together somewhere and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. They do get together, but it's usually extremely boring. Like, if you were unfortunate enough to have gone to this Davos conference the other day, I'm sure you would have been bored out of your mind. I mean, I didn't go and I didn't see the document, but having read things like that, I do a lot of reading of this stuff. Like the Trilateral Commission is one of them, and they publish regular documents. It's so boring. I mean, after a couple of years, I stopped subscribing. You know, it was so predictable and boring and pablum and so on and so forth. And besides, you can read it in Foreign Affairs or the New York Times business page or wherever you want any day.